A group of developing countries is pushing for a new economic world order. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. The group of developing countries known as the G77 plus China is gathering in Havana in Cuba. Despite the name, the G77 includes more than 130 nations representing 80% of the global population. They're trying to establish a new economic world order and promote science, technology and innovation. Philip Crowther has more from Havana.
Historically, it's been very difficult for this group, the G77, to find common ground simply because it is such a large group, larger still than it was at its founding. 134 countries are now part of this bloc of developing countries. It represents 2/3 of the United Nations, 80% of the world population. And when you look at what is actually happening at the summit here in Havana, well, it's a lot of speeches, a lot of heads of state and government, a lot of representatives getting through their speeches. That's essentially what we're seeing here over the last 12 hours or so, and there's more to come on this Saturday, the second day of this summit. Now, not all of these countries are represented at the highest level. There are presidents here, there are heads of state here, the likes of President Lula of Brazil, President Maduro of Venezuela is here as well, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, and UN Secretary Antonio Guterres, who gave the opening remarks here in Havana.
Poverty is on the rise, hunger is increasing, prices are soaring, debt is exorbitant, and climate disasters are becoming more frequent. Global framework systems have failed. The conclusion is clear. The world is failing developing countries.
A clear call there from the UN Secretary General for developing countries to have a more important role. As this bloc of the G77 plus China, they are already a strong negotiating group, especially when it comes to the negotiations on climate change that we see every year during the COP summits. That's when this group performs at its best, in a sense, as a negotiating bloc. China's role particularly interesting here, of course, with the likes of Venezuelan President Maduro calling on China and India to help developing countries with science, technology and innovation. Those, by the way, are the main themes officially, according to the Cuban government, of this summit here in Havana. For Cuba, getting all of these countries together at such a difficult time, at a time of an economic crisis here on the island, will probably be deemed a success already by the Cuban government. Philip Crowther with the Associated Press for CGTN in Havana.
There is a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. From Shanghai, Zoon Ahmed Khan is a research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Benjamin Norton is founder and editor-in-chief of the Geopolitical Economy Report. He joins us from Beijing. Here in Washington, D.C., Abdullahi Boru Halakhe is an Africa security and policy analyst. Also here in D.C., Sourabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you. Ben Norton, the G77 was founded in 1964. I mean, there were many countries at that time that didn't even have their independence. And developing countries did not have much of a voice in international affairs. Now, just as we heard in that report, it's grown to 134 countries. The group has been meeting in Havana. Give us a sense of the significance of a group like this, coming at a time when we are seeing the global south becoming far more vocal and more assertive in its relations with the rest of the world.
Absolutely. You made a crucial point. We should keep in mind the historical context. The G77 plus China was formed in 1964 at the peak of the anti-colonial national liberation struggles. And that historical context is very important today because what we really see across the global south are many leaders who are invoking the legacy of the anti-colonial struggles. In West Africa right now, there is a mass wave of resistance against what they refer to as French neo-colonialism. They're protesting the fact, for instance, that France controls the monetary policy of these countries still, which are formally independent politically on paper. And yet many countries in the global south still feel, especially economically, that they don't have much sovereignty. I will say that, in fact, the United Nations, just this July, the Global Crisis Response Group released a very important report detailing how systematically unequal and unfair the financial system is, and how countries in the global south, which need financing for development goals to reduce poverty, to build infrastructure, are forced to borrow at much higher interest rates. It's more difficult for them to service their public debt. Their public debt as a percentage of international public debt is rising at a much faster rate than the debt of the rich countries in the global north. So the entire international financial system was designed in a way that is completely unfair. And the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said at this conference in Cuba that the United Nations will always listen to the voice of the global south. But I think we do have to challenge whether or not that's actually true, because it's not because of Guterres as a person, it's because of the structure of the UN. The reason an organization like the G77 plus China is so important is because the global south has not been given an adequate voice in institutions like the UN. The Security Council desperately needs to be reformed. Why is it that countries like the UK and France, which have a population of fewer than 70 million people, have permanent seats with permanent vetoes on the Security Council? And yet countries like India, which has 1.4 billion people, or Pakistan, or Bangladesh, or Brazil, or Indonesia, which have significantly larger populations, are not given the same weight in international affairs. This is why so many countries representing 4/5 of the global population are meeting in Cuba and calling for a new international system, because the existing system is clearly biased against their interests.
Sourabh Gupta, this meeting is taking place in Havana in Cuba, and that is a country that is facing some of the harshest sanctions ever imposed on a country. These sanctions imposed by the United States. The trade embargo, which was imposed in 1962, remains in place to this day. Let's listen to what the Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, had to say at this gathering in Havana.
Let us fight for our right to development, which is also the right to exist as a species. Only then we will be in a position to take part in the scientific and technical revolution on an equal footing. Only then we will be able to take our rightful place in a world that tries to relegate us to the status of meek providers of wealth for minorities.
So, Sourabh, what is your view on this gathering and what it means to what we see right now, as Ben told us as well, a rapidly evolving world?
Rapidly evolving world, and frankly, and unfortunately, a world that's evolving not for the better. We had a UN-centered system, and even though there is an inequality within its economic institutions, at least there was a sense of UN-centeredness. That sense of UN-centeredness is collapsing because many of the powerful, rich countries would like to create their own like-minded group of friends and try to work and recreate that system. And this is becoming more of a power-based system rather than a rules-based system. Granted, not all the rules were followed in the first place, but at least there was a notional adherence to those rules and an aspiration to broaden development at a multilateral level, which would benefit all. As the rich countries see themselves a little bit on the ropes economically, and with power shifting away from them, they have chosen to sort of privatize the public goods that they provided initially among what they would say is a like-minded group of buddies, and and hope to append the rest of the international system, or at least that part of the international system which would be willing to append itself to the rich countries. And that, I'm afraid, is for the global south and for developing countries and emerging markets a terrible proposition, because as we've seen, the last 20-30 years of globalization has been an enormous era of progress, particularly for poorer countries, both not just in terms of getting wealthy, but also in terms of more capacity building, in terms of their own development, in terms of health, and in terms of education, etc. And now that era might be collapsing under the weight of this concept of like-minded blocks. And that's why I think it's that much more important right now, particularly with the with the system, with the UN system behind on its sustainable development goals, that the global south once again get together once we are meeting in person after the pandemic and shout for its right to development. And I think that is what is going on at this point of time. And I hope it will be championed forcefully and within United Nations structures.
Zoon, great to see you again. This grouping, of course, is called the G77 plus China. How important is it for China to participate in a group like this? And what is the role that China is playing right now in international relations, and especially as one of the main representatives of the global south?
Thank you, Anand. Likewise, great to see you as well. I think one thing, this is a big question, but I'll try to answer by saying that we see the trajectory of developing countries. I mean, just as our previous panelists have also noted, the rising voice of the countries of the G77, which are now 134 countries, is an important trajectory to note. And what all of these countries have in common is that they are united to fight for more equality for more people. They are united also because they have faced discrimination. They are the ones that are facing the impact of climate change. They are the ones that are facing poverty at its harshest, and they are the ones at the lower end when it comes to our global economic policies and representation in the United Nations. That said, today what China truly stands for when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is now also proposed the Global Development Initiative and the GSI and GCI, is that we need to unite collectively to channelize our resources and our strengths and address the sustainable development goals, work towards people-centric development. This is one of China's biggest successes, to demonstrate that, for example, poverty alleviation does not mean that you need to give stipends to poor people. It can be about opportunity creation, how to incorporate critical thinking in that process of improving the circumstances for ordinary people. It is also important to note that China right now is playing an incredible role in helping developing countries to transition towards greener technologies, which is a role that no developed country is playing currently, not at the same scale, to say the speak. For example, I'll also give another example. In 2015, many developing countries felt that they have the right to develop, energy resources that are not climate friendly, because you cannot think about climate change when on an empty stomach. But that conversation changed with deliberate efforts by China. So in a nutshell, I think it's quite evident, even given the recent accomplishments of the G77 at the previous COP27 that we can talk about in more detail later, but also given that countries such as Cuba, Venezuela, Iran today are not the peripheries. They are at the center stage. They are playing a critical role in their regions and in the G77 platform as well. And that is what the G77 plus China group stands for: an increasing voice for the 80%, increasing relevance for the 80%, and increasing bargaining power as a collective.
Abdullahi, many of the countries in the G77 come from the continent of Africa. I mean, what can you tell us about Africa's participation? And as we heard our reporter tell us at the beginning of the show, this is a huge group. It's very difficult to get consensus with a group this size. Are Africa's priorities very different from, other parts of the global south?
No, thank you so much. I think the priorities are more or less aligned on most critical issues. That is the right to development as well as addressing climate change. I think what we need to realize is that, some of the African countries are members of the BRICS. Now some of them are members of G77. I think the reality is we're living in a world that is where most of these countries, when they were formed as a bloc, they were largely non-aligned. Now what we have is multi-aligned. You see India as part of G77, and it was the G20, and it's also part of the BRICS. And it's the same with groups like countries like Brazil. So really, for the many African countries, climate change and the rights to development are intricately linked. And the fact that most of the African countries, if you look at the percentage emission of greenhouse gases that African countries have emitted, is less than 4%. But most of these African countries are at the sharp end of climate change. I'll give an example in South Sudan, where I was just a few months ago. What you see is that South Sudan is bearing the brunt of climate change in both ways. There are parts of South Sudan that are largely submerged. That's almost a half of the country. And there's one part that is experiencing drought. Somalia, for instance, which is in the front line of climate change. So what African countries are saying, they need their voices to be heard. And a lot of what happens in Cuba now is going to be transmitted into COP28, which will be hosted by Abu Dhabi in a couple of months.
Ben, you posted a tweet recently about Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro visiting China and meeting with President Xi Jinping. Maduro said that the partnership is, quote, not about dominating countries, much less taking their resources or wealth. On the contrary, it is the century of a different world, pluripolar and pluricentric. Talk to us about that new vision for the world.
Absolutely. Many progressive leaders in Latin America have been urgently calling for the creation of a new international order, exactly the kinds of calls we see at the summit of the G77 plus China in Cuba, because they can clearly see that, first of all, the international financial system is designed in a way that goes against their interests, but also, furthermore, the international judicial system, the international legal framework is not effective because there are certain countries in the global north, in particular the United States, which wage wars, invasions, foreign interventions, regime change operations, and face no consequences, in particular in a country like Latin America. In the case of Venezuela, there was an attempted invasion of Venezuela in May 2020 by a series of mercenaries who were trained by the United States. That we have documents proving this. Donald Trump personally approved this operation, and it was being led by two former U.S. military officers, two Green Berets. And yet there is no outrage over this. The sanctions that the United States has imposed on countries representing 1/4 of global population and 1/3 of the global economy, of global GDP. Why are there no consequences for this illegal behavior that violates international law? So, I mean, we should also keep in mind that the United States is currently instrumentalizing other blocs, like, for instance, the G20, and trying to essentially say that certain countries are not welcome. At the G20, we saw that the United States and other Western allies were pressuring countries to release a statement demonizing Russia. And keep in mind that this is after Russia was kicked out of the G8 in 2014. So we see that global north countries, on average, are engaging in very exclusive behavior and trying to make these blocs smaller and smaller, only including their friends, excluding countries they deem to be their enemies and adversaries. That's why something like the G77 plus China is so important. It is much more inclusive. Again, it represents 80% of the global population. And one final note, the G77 plus China was created in, excuse me, we should keep in mind that the G20 was created in the 1990s, whereas the G77 is much older. The G20 was created in the 1990s in response to the sovereign debt crises in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And it really came into the fore in 2008 in response to the North Atlantic financial crisis. So the G20 was largely a response to the kinds of crises that we're seeing in the world today. And I think the G77 plus China can play a much more effective role in dealing with these financial crises and the debt crises that global South countries are trapped in by providing new alternatives and creating new financial institutions. The BRICS New Development Bank, I think, is paving the way for that.
So, Rob, looking at a group like the G77, which is actually 134 countries, I mean, it's a huge group. It, as we've been saying, represents 80% of the global population. If we look at other groups like BRICS as well, it's also a big group now representing the biggest amount of the world's GDP. Yet there are those who would argue, especially those in the West, who would argue that it's the United States and its allies that still hold the cards. Ben was talking about how power is exercised by the United States and its allies. I mean, how would you respond to that? What would you say to that?
I would agree with that proposition that power, ultimate power, I mean, peak at the summit is held by the global north. And that's why we've seen, however much we can criticize it, the relative success of the sanctions that the US has imposed on Russia. I know there are a lot of loopholes which need to be plugged out there. But think about this. This is a UN Security Council permanent member sanctioning another permanent member. And that takes not just guts, but some a certain amount of capacity. And the main point out here is that the global north still has control of the infrastructure plumbing of the global economy, be it in terms of trade, be it in terms of finance, be it in terms of the digital economy. And that's why part of what the G77 and China is trying to do, and what the developing countries are trying to do, is that create enough power at their end so that they can have certain deterrent capability, so that any, say, a data packet which goes through a US server does not automatically become a matter of jeopardy for their development. Being held in Cuba, I mean, the embargo is essentially WTO illegal, and yet, I mean, it's been there forever, and not much has been done. But the point that the G77 is trying to get at is that we will fight against this idea of trying to recreate a power-based system, because we have power, but we would rather prefer that we have a rules-based system. And as I mentioned, as the global north is beginning to lose some of its power, it is choosing to husband whatever residual power it has and trying to shift to a power-based system and away from that rules-based system, because that rules-based system doesn't serve its purpose as much, because, hey, other people are prospering more than they are in some respects. And it is precisely at that point that the global south and the big emerging markets and the BRIC countries, despite divisions within themselves, within the G77 also, they're food importing countries, they're food exporting countries on climate change, the small island states, and there are also big developing countries which are huge polluters. But at the same time, they want to have a common position, because that overarching rules-based system needs to be maintained, because they feel that they can one day work themselves into a position of power, and then with those rules create a more equitable universe. And I think that's where they are headed, and it's going to be a struggle, and it's not going to be straightforward, because, as I said, the infrastructural plumbing still is in the hands of the global north, and that's not being surrendered at any point of time in the near future, frankly.
Abdullahi, in his address to the opening of the G77, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, he made some very pointed comments there. We had that in our report at the beginning of the show, but I'll just paraphrase some of what he had to say. He said, poverty is on the rise, hunger is increasing, prices are soaring, debt is exorbitant, and climate disasters are becoming more frequent. The global framework systems have failed. The conclusion is clear. The world is failing developing countries. How do you see that? Is the world failing developing countries?
The world is failing the developing countries, because if the rate at which you are borrowing from the international market is exorbitant, that means you're going to be saddled with debt. According to the latest IMF numbers, over 20 African countries, their ratio of GDP to debt is unsustainable. So that means they either have to restructure their debt or take IMF restructuring program, which essentially means cutting primary public delivery of services, that is water, education, and health. That happened in 1990s, and we know how that damaged most of the African countries. Climate change, African countries did not contribute disproportionately compared to Western countries. They are not getting loss and damage that was agreed, the fund that was agreed in Egypt last year, and I don't think any change will come out of it in United Arab Emirates in November, end of November, December. You see what is happening in Libya because of climate change. So the reality is the global north and the world has failed African countries. Although I must add that some of the leaders in the African countries have not helped their cause either. They need to get into the business of having prudent public finance management system, root out corruption, or at the very minimum, reduce its impact. Because what is going to happen is that we are headed for a serious combination of climate change and debt crisis in the next couple of years on the African continent. And if those two things combine, you're going to see some of the gains that were made in the 2000s all of them nearly erased.
Zoon, one thing that the G77 has been able to achieve, and this was at COP27, the climate change conference, was a loss and damage fund. That's to support the victims of climate disasters. And of course, many developing countries, they contribute little to greenhouse emissions, but they are very vulnerable to climate disasters. I mean, how important is it for the G77 as a group, a big group, to push for financial help to combat the effects of climate change, and also for help with shifting to a green economy?
Anand, this was a historic achievement by the G77. Let's also remember, last year was a year when many developing countries, including at that time the chair Pakistan, faced unprecedented climate disasters. The floods in Pakistan left 33 million people homeless and killed many. Half the country was underwater. And that was a point, for many others, for example, the African continent, which emits the least but is affected the most as a continent by climate change. And the real quest for developing countries is to change the conversation on climate change and really talk about how are we, developing countries that have not contributed to the current situation, to be compensated? What is the role that developed countries ought to be playing? What do they owe? And one thing to recognize is that it wasn't up until the last moment that developed regions agreed to this loss and damage fund. It seemed impossible just a few years ago. So there is strength in our ability to unite, to realize our collective challenges, our issues, and to do the homework. And that is exactly what the G77 did for the COP27. There was months of work in that. There were fruitful negotiations. There was a commitment to achieve that. So of course, this is a big step, and it shows that the G77 is not just about developing countries, the 80% coming together and talking about how unequal the world is. It is unequal. It is about us uniting and recognizing what are the priority areas that we need to work on, how to negotiate as a collective. And I'll also quickly add that, of course, all of our panelists have pointed how the developed countries are creating this elite club. But let's also see that today the developing countries have rejected the authority of that elite club. Today, in response to the BRI, the United States and Europe are coming up with their own infrastructure plans because they recognize that what the developing world needs, what these regions need, what these countries ask for matters. And that is a shift in the conversation.
Right, and that is where we are going to have to leave it. We have run out of time. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.